So let's just imagine for a second a world with no rules, no laws, and nobody there to enforce them. What would you do to survive? This isn't just some abstract thought experiment. It's the absolute nightmare that fueled one of the most important and, yeah, controversial books ever written, Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan. Today, we're going to dive into his pretty radical answer to a huge question. How do you build a government that's strong enough to save us from ourselves? This quote right here, it gets right to the heart of what absolutely terrified Hobbes. For him, the alternative to a powerful state isn't freedom. No, it's pure, nonstop chaos. A condition of war, where life is, in his famous words, solitary, poor, nasty, British, and short. As far as Hobbes was concerned, the one and only job of a government is to stop us from falling into that catastrophic mess. So, to solve this life or death problem, Hobbes said we have to be brutally logical. You have to forget all your feelings about what's fair or what feels right. We need to look at government like an engineer looks at a set of blueprints. What are the basic designs that are even possible for us? Well, according to Hobbes, the answer is kind of surprising. Forget all the complicated political labels you've ever heard. When you strip it all down to the studs, there are only three fundamental ways to structure a state. Just three. That's it. First up, monarchy. Super simple, very direct. All the sovereign power, the final say on absolutely everything, rests in the hands of one single person. Second option, democracy. In this setup, sovereignty belongs to an assembly that pretty much any citizen can join. The people, all together, are the ruler. And the third and final form is aristocracy. Now, power here is also held by an assembly, but think of it more like a VIP club. It's an exclusive group, just one part of the population, not the whole shebang. Okay, now this is where Hobbes gets really radical, even for today. He argues that words like tyranny or oligarchy, they're not actually different kinds of government at all. They're just insults. They're what we call a monarchy or an aristocracy when we don't like the people in charge. For Hobbes, getting caught up in these emotional labels is just a dangerous distraction from the cold, hard logic of how power actually works. And here we have it. This is the absolute core of his entire argument. No matter which of the three forms you pick, that sovereign power must be total and it can't be split. The second you create two competing centers of power, say a king and a parliament who both think they have the final say, you're not building a state anymore. You are literally building the blueprint for a civil war. So, if there are only three choices, and the power has to be absolute in any of them, how in the world do you pick one? Well, for Hobbes, the test isn't about lofty ideas like justice or freedom. It's a simple stress test. Which of these forms is the best at keeping the peace and providing security? To figure this out, Hobbes runs this really rigorous stress test. He compares monarchy head-to-head against assemblies, democracies and aristocracies, across 6 key areas. He's totally convinced that this practical comparison will show that one form, while, not perfect, is just clearly the most reliable option. This first point is what Hobbes sees as his knockout punch. In a monarchy, the ruler's private interest is the exact same as the public's interest. A king only gets richer and more powerful if his nation is thriving, but in an assembly, a politician can get rich or famous through some shady backroom deal, or even by helping to start a civil war. The incentives are just dangerously out of whack. And Hobbes just keeps rolling with these practical points. A monarch can get secret advice from any expert he wants anytime. An assembly, it's stuck with public speeches from people who might be persuasive but aren't necessarily experts. A monarch's decisions are consistent. An assembly's policies can flip-flop depending on who shows up to vote that day. And maybe most important of all, a monarch can't disagree with himself, but an assembly is the perfect breeding ground for factions and, you guessed it, civil war. Okay, you might be thinking, but what about corruption? A king is just going to make his friends rich. Hobbes basically shrugs and calls this an inevitable inconvenience. But then he flips the whole argument. An assembly is just as easily swayed by charismatic speakers, their version of flatterers. And what's worse, an assembly has way more friends and family to reward than a single monarch does. The corruption doesn't go away, it just gets multiplied. So what about a compromise? Can't we have a limited monarchy, or maybe mix the best parts of all three systems together? For Hobbes, this is a dangerous fantasy. He says you simply cannot have it both ways. And here's his critical point. If a king's power is limited by someone else, then he isn't the real sovereign. the person or the assembly that sets those limits, they are the true sovereign. That so-called limited king is really just a public minister, a high-level employee. Hobbes just wants us to be honest about where the buck really stops. So Hobbes has made this powerful case for monarchy, but there's a huge, fatal flaw staring him in the face. The monarch is human. They're going to die, and when they do, doesn't the whole state die with them, plunging everyone right back into that chaos? How do you give this artificial man, the state, a kind of artificial immortality? This is the single biggest vulnerability of the entire system. The death of the sovereign creates a power vacuum, and a power vacuum is a doorway straight back to the state of war. This problem absolutely must be solved. Hobbes' solution is what he calls artificial eternity, and the tool to achieve it is the right of succession. It has to be a set of clear, unbreakable rules that make sure power transfers seamlessly, without a single moment of doubt or dispute. To stop the chaos before it can even start, Hobbes lays out this really clear three-tiered system for figuring out who's next. It goes from the most obvious, explicit instruction all the way down to a logical guess about human nature, leaving absolutely no room for a power vacuum. First and simplest is the monarch's express will. They just name their heir in writing. Done. If they don't, you fall back to custom. If the firstborn son has always inherited, well, that's the rule. And if there's no will and no custom, then you rely on what he calls natural affection. A monarch would obviously prefer their own child. The whole system is built to leave zero wiggle room for a power struggle. And this brings us right back around to the ultimate goal of the whole thing. This entire elaborate system, the absolute power, the rejection of mixed government, the super detailed rules of succession, it is all designed for one purpose: to provide a lasting, perpetual peace, not just some temporary ceasefire that falls apart when one leader dies. Which leaves us with the really stark choice that Hobbes forces on us. He argues that the horrors of civil war are so awful, so absolute, that even an oppressive government is a better alternative. The only thing worse than one all-powerful ruler is having no ruler at all. So the question he leaves for us is he right? Is total stability worth the price of absolute power?